I found out I wasn't my dad's real son, and my whole childhood suddenly made sense. I 31M always felt like the outsider in my own home. My father was strict, distant, and never really looked at me the way he looked at my younger brother. I always thought maybe I just wasn't the sporty kid he wanted. My mom tried to balance things out, but there was always a weird tension between her and Dad, especially when I was around. The letter that changed everything, the rain, was relentless, hammering against the roof of the old house like it was trying to drown out the grief inside. Ethan Carver sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor of his father's study, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the faint smell of dust and old paper. At 31, he was no stranger to loss, friends, relationships, even a few dreams, but nothing had prepared him for this. His father, Richard Carver, was gone. A heart attack, sudden and unforgiving, had taken him 2 weeks ago. The funeral had been a blur of black umbrellas, murmured condolences, and his mother's quiet sobs. Now, Ethan was back in the house he'd grown up in, helping his mother sort through a lifetime of memories. The study was a time capsule. Richard's desk, a hulking oak monstrosity, dominated the room, its surface cluttered with pens, a cracked coffee mug, and a faded photograph of Ethan and his younger brother, Jake, from a fishing trip years ago. Ethan's fingers lingered on the frame, his reflection staring back at him in the glass. He didn't look like Jake. Never had. Jake was broad-shouldered, with their father's square jaw and piercing blue eyes. Ethan was leaner, with dark brown eyes and a face that always seemed to carry a question he couldn't quite articulate. "Ethan, honey, you don't have to do this today," his mother, Susan, said from the doorway. Her voice was soft, frayed at the edges like she'd been crying again. She was 62 but looked older now, her auburn hair streaked with gray, her hands twisting a dish towel nervously. "It's fine, Mom," Ethan said, forcing a smile. "Keeps me busy." She nodded, but her eyes darted to the desk, lingering on the locked drawer Ethan had been eyeing for the past hour. "Just don't push yourself too hard. I'll make some tea." As she disappeared into the kitchen, Ethan's gaze returned to the drawer. It was the only one in the desk that didn't budge, secured with a small brass lock that looked out of place in the otherwise utilitarian piece of furniture. His father had always been particular about that drawer, brushing off questions about it with a gruff, "Just papers." Curiosity gnawed at Ethan, sharper now in the wake of his father's death. What could be so important that Richard had kept it under lock and key? He rummaged through the other drawers until he found a small ring of keys tucked inside a cigar box. One of them, a tiny silver key, looked like it might fit. His heart thudded as he slid it into the lock and turned. The mechanism clicked, and the drawer slid open with a soft creak. Inside were a few folders, a stack of old tax documents, and a single sealed envelope. Ethan's name was written on it in his father's precise handwriting. No date, no other markings, just Ethan. His breath caught. He glanced toward the doorway, half expecting his mother to reappear, but the house was quiet except for the rain. He tore the envelope open, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. The letter inside was handwritten, the ink slightly faded but legible. Ethan's hands trembled as he began to read. "Ethan, if you're reading this, I'm gone. There's no easy way to say what I need to say, so I'll just say it. You're not my son, not by blood. Your mother had an affair before we married with a man she loved before me. You were the result. I chose to raise you as my own, but I won't lie, it was never easy. Every time I looked at you, I saw him. I tried to love you the way I loved Jake, but I couldn't. I'm sorry for that. I hope you can forgive me and your mother. She wanted to tell you, but I wouldn't let her. This is my burden, not hers." Richard Ethan's vision blurred, the words swimming on the page. He read it again, then a third time, as if repetition could change the meaning. His father, the man who'd taught him how to ride a bike, who'd yelled at him for sneaking out at 16, who'd never hugged him without a trace of hesitation, wasn't his father. The revelation hit like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He dropped the letter, his hands shaking too badly to hold it. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. All those years of feeling like an outsider, of wondering why Richard's affection always seemed to stop short with him, snapped into focus. The distance, the silences, the way Richard's eyes would flicker with something unreadable when Ethan asked about his childhood. It all made sense now. Ethan wasn't his son. He was a reminder of betrayal, a living scar. "Ethan," his mother's voice cut through the fog. She stood in the doorway, holding a steaming mug of tea, her face pale. Her eyes landed on the letter and the mug slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. "Oh, God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "You knew," Ethan said, his voice low, almost a growl. "You knew this whole time." "Ethan, please," Susan said, stepping over the broken ceramic. "Let me explain." "Explain?" He stood, the letter crumpled in his fist. "You lied to me for 31 years. You let me grow up thinking." His voice broke, and he hated himself for it. Thinking I was his, thinking I was doing something wrong every time he looked at me like I didn't belong. Susan's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to tell you, I swear I did, but Richard, he made me promise. He said it would hurt you more to know." "Hurt me more?" Ethan laughed, a bitter, jagged sound. "You think this doesn't hurt, finding out my whole life was a lie? That I'm some mistake? You are not a mistake," Susan said fiercely, grabbing his arm. "You're my son, I love you, I've always loved you." Ethan pulled away, his chest tight. "Who's my real father, Mom?" "Who is he?" Susan's face crumpled and she sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "His name is David Harper. We were in love in high school before I met Richard. Things ended when we went to different colleges, but we reconnected years later just before I got engaged. It was a mistake, Ethan, a moment of weakness. I never meant for it to happen." "A moment of weakness," Ethan repeated, the words tasting like ash. "And I'm the result." "Ethan, please," Susan said, reaching for him again. "You have to understand." "I don't have to understand anything," he snapped, backing toward the door. "You kept this from me, both of you. And now he's gone, and I can't even ask him why he couldn't love me." He stormed out of the study, ignoring his mother's pleas. The house felt suffocating, the walls closing in with every step. He grabbed his coat and keys and headed for the door, the rain a fitting backdrop to the chaos in his mind. The next few days were a haze. Ethan checked into a motel on the edge of town, unable to face his mother or the house that now felt like a lie. He didn't tell Jake, who was back at college, blissfully unaware of the bomb that had just detonated in Ethan's life. The letter stayed in his pocket, a constant weight, its words burned into his memory. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, replaying his childhood. The times Richard had taken Jake to baseball games but left Ethan behind with a vague excuse. The way his mother would hover when Ethan and Richard argued, like she was waiting for something to break. The subtle differences in how Richard treated him, never abusive but never warm. Ethan had always chalked it up to personality clashes, to not being the son his father wanted. Now he knew the truth. He wasn't the son his father chose. The question of what to do next gnawed at him. Should he confront his mother again, demand more answers? Should he track down David Harper, a man who might not even know he existed? Or should he bury the letter and pretend he'd never found it, preserving the fragile peace of his family? He started with the internet. A quick search for David Harper yielded too many results, but narrowing it down to their hometown helped. There was a David Harper, 59, living 2 states away. A LinkedIn profile showed a man with a kind smile, graying hair, and a career as a high school history teacher. Ethan stared at the photo, searching for traces of himself in the man's features. The eyes, maybe, the shape of the jaw, it was hard to tell. He didn't call, didn't email. Instead, he drove. 8 hours through rain and fog to a small town in Ohio where David Harper lived. The house was modest, a single story with a neatly trimmed lawn and a mailbox that read Harper. Ethan sat in his car across the street, his heart pounding. What was he even doing here? What did he expect? A tearful reunion, a man who'd welcome him with open arms. The front door opened and a man stepped out, carrying a watering can. He was older than the LinkedIn photo, his hair more silver than gray, but it was unmistakably David. Ethan's breath caught. This was his father, his real father. The man moved with a quiet ease, watering the flowers along the porch, oblivious to the stranger watching him from the car. Ethan's hand hovered over the door handle, but he couldn't move. What would he say? "Hi, I'm the son you didn't know you had." The absurdity of it stopped him cold. He drove away, his mind a tangle of anger and longing. Back at the motel, Ethan called his best friend, Matt, the only person he felt he could talk to. Matt listened quietly as Ethan poured out the story, the letter, his mother's confession, the drive to Ohio. When he finished, Matt let out a low whistle. "Man, that's heavy," Matt said. "What are you gonna do?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted. "Part of me wants to meet this guy, see if he's worth knowing. Part of me wants to scream at my mom for lying. And part of me just wants to forget the whole thing." "You can't forget something like this," Matt said. "It's your life. You deserve to know the truth, all of it, but you gotta decide what you want from it. Closure. A new dad. Revenge." Ethan laughed, a hollow sound. "Revenge? I don't even know who I'm mad at anymore." "Talk to your mom again," Matt suggested. "Not to yell, but to listen. She's probably carrying a lot of guilt. And maybe she's got more to tell you." Ethan wasn't sure he was ready for that, but the idea stuck. He drove back to his mother's house the next day, his stomach knotted with dread. Susan was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables with mechanical precision. She froze when she saw him. "I didn't think you'd come back," she said quietly. "I almost didn't," Ethan said, sitting at the table. "But I need to know more. About David, about why you never told me." Susan set the knife down and wiped her hands on her apron. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll tell you everything." Over the next hour, Susan laid out the story. She and David had been high school sweethearts, inseparable until college tore them apart. When they reconnected years later, Susan was engaged to Richard, but old feelings resurfaced. One night, one mistake, and she was pregnant. She told Richard the truth, expecting him to leave her. Instead, he proposed, vowing to raise Ethan as his own. But the weight of that promise wore on him, and Susan carried the guilt of knowing she'd trapped him in a life he hadn't fully chosen. "David never knew," Susan said, tears streaming down her face. "I couldn't tell him, it would have destroyed everything." Ethan's throat tightened. "Did you ever think about what it would do to me? Growing up feeling like I didn't belong." "Every day," Susan whispered. "But I thought I was protecting you. I thought if you didn't know, you could have a normal life." "Normal," Ethan echoed, shaking his head. "I haven't felt normal a day in my life." They sat in silence, the weight of 31 years of secrets between them. Ethan wanted to hate her, but he couldn't. She was still his mother, the one who'd bandaged his scraped knees, who'd stayed up late helping him with homework, who'd loved him even when he felt unlovable. "I need time," he said finally. "I don't know what I'm going to do, but I need time." Susan nodded, her eyes red. "Take all the time you need. I'm here, Ethan, always." The weeks that followed were a slow unraveling. Ethan returned to his apartment in the city, throwing himself into work to avoid the questions that haunted him. He didn't tell Jake, honoring his mother's request, but the secret felt like a betrayal of its own. Jake deserved to know, didn't he? Or would it only hurt him too? Ethan kept David's address in his wallet, a quiet temptation. He thought about writing a letter, something anonymous to test the waters, but every draft ended up in the trash. What could he say that wouldn't upend this stranger's life? One night, unable to sleep, Ethan pulled out the letter again. He read it not as a son, but as a man trying to understand the father who'd raised him. Richard's words were blunt, almost cold, but there was a flicker of vulnerability in them. "I'm sorry for that. I hope you can forgive me." Ethan had spent his life chasing his father's approval, never realizing it was an impossible goal. Richard had tried in his own flawed way to be a father. Maybe that was enough. He started therapy, a decision that surprised even himself. The sessions were raw, sometimes painful, but they gave him a space to untangle his anger and grief. He talked about Richard, about Susan, about the father he'd never met. He talked about the boy who'd always felt like he was on the outside looking in. Months later, Ethan made a decision. He wrote to David Harper, not to reveal the truth, but to connect, however tentatively. The letter was simple. "Hi, my name is Ethan. I think we might have a connection through my mother, Susan. I'd like to talk if you're open to it." He didn't expect a response, but sending it felt like a step towards something. David replied a week later, his tone warm but cautious. They met for coffee in a neutral town, halfway between their homes. David was kind, curious, and completely unaware of the truth. Ethan didn't tell him, not yet, but they talked for hours about history, about books, about life. It was enough for now. Back home, Ethan called his mother. "I met him," he said simply. "I'm not ready to tell him anything, but I wanted you to know." Susan's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you, Ethan, for telling me." "I'm still figuring this out," he said. "But I'm not running anymore." The rain had stopped by the time Ethan hung up the phone. He stepped onto his balcony, the city lights stretching out before him. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of peace. He wasn't his father's son, not by blood, but he was his mother's. He was Jake's brother. And maybe, just maybe, he was starting to become his own man. The letter still sat on his desk, a reminder of the truth that had shattered him and set him free. He didn't need to bury it or burn it or carry it like a weight. It was just a piece of his story, when he was finally ready to write for himself. So that is for today's story. If you like the story, share it with others, and follow for more real-life stories and heartfelt experiences. Your support means everything, and it helps us share more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.